Chapter 7 Two Worlds Collide, 1850 to 1887. The Big Picture. The settling of the West by non-Indians and the destruction of the great bison herds, the center of Plains life, changed human history here. In the second half of the 1880s, a series of changes swept across Montana that profoundly transformed human history in this place. The fur trade had already changed economic patterns. Disease had weakened many tribes. Into this shifting world came the settlers, first traveling through on their way west, and then coming to stay. These settlers brought foreign ideas about how to use the land, ideas that their government imposed on the Indian tribes. Even more traumatically, the bison were nearly destroyed. The vast herds that had fed and supported Plains Indians for 10,000 years were killed off by the millions. Picture all these forces gathering like a tornado. It tore across Montana during this time and changed human history in this place forever. Nations in Negotiation. Treaties that changed Montana history. Long before Euro-Americans, who are Americans with European influence or ancestry, wanted to settle in the Plains region, they began working on better ways to get across it. In the 1850s, the government began surveying routes for a transcontinental
all the way across the continent
railroad to connect the west coast to the rest of the country. But to build railroads, the government had to get permission from the Indian tribes who controlled the land. So the U.S. government negotiated a series of treaties, agreement between governments, with American Indian tribes across the West. These treaties are important for two main reasons. First, in establishing reservations, the government acknowledged that tribes were legal owners of their own lands. Second, the treaties recognized Indian tribes as sovereign, which means independent and self-governing, nations. No other ethnic group holds sovereignty over lands within the United States. The treaties between the United States and the sovereign Indian nations form the basis for Indian law today. The treaties of the 1850s all outlined similar agreements. They identified the traditional territories that each tribe controlled or lived in. This legally established tribal sovereignty in each area. This was the first step toward establishing Indian reservations, which is land that tribes reserved for their own use through treaties. The U.S. government did not give reservation lands to tribes. Reservations are lands the tribes were able to keep for themselves. In many cases, reservations are remnants of Indian tribes' traditional territories. The treaties also gave the United States permission to build roads, railroads, and settlements on Indian land in exchange for annuities. Annuities are annual payments in the form of food, equipment, supplies, and funds that the U.S. government owed a tribe by treaty. Some of the treaties also pledged the Indian tribes to make peace with one another. To negotiate the treaties, government representatives met with tribal leaders at gatherings called treaty councils. Each party at these councils had its own goals. The government wanted the Indian people to settle into villages, to become farmers, to convert to Christianity, and to live like Euro-Americans. This is called assimilation, when one culture is absorbed into the majority culture. The government also wanted the Indian tribes to cede, which means to give up, vast regions of their land, so that non-Indians could build farms, towns, and roads. Each tribe had its own goals, too. Each wanted to maintain or increase its territory and power, and to preserve the people's way of life. The tribes also wanted government protection from their enemies and from settlers as well. The trouble with treaties. There were four basic problems with the treaties. First, the treaties were based on the Euro-American idea that land could be bought and sold. Plains and Plateau Indian tribes fought to control territory, but they did not believe that land was something an individual or tribe could own, much less buy or sell. In most Plains Indian traditions, the land was the supreme provider of all life. It was literally made up of the blood and bones of the people's ancestors. These opposing ideas led to many conflicts over the land. Another problem was the language difference. U.S. government representatives spoke English. Tribal leaders each spoke their own tribal language. Every idea had to go through several translations. Often the translators were not very skillful, so there were many misunderstandings. A third problem was that government representatives misunderstood the structure of Indian tribes. They assumed that Indian chiefs could speak for their people the way a U.S. president could do. But this was not the way tribes organized themselves. Different tribes had different political structures. Individual bands had military leaders, political leaders, and spiritual leaders. The people looked to these chiefs for their wisdom and experience, but they were not necessarily obligated to do what they said. Sometimes, negotiators for the U.S. side took advantage of this loose organization of tribal leaders. If one chief refused to sign a treaty, the negotiators would simply find a different chief who would sign. But the government still expected all tribal members to comply with the treaty, no matter which chief signed. Then, if some bands or individual tribal members did not comply with terms of the treaties, the U.S. government sent in military troops to force them to comply. The fourth big problem with the U.S. Indian treaties was that the U.S. government often did not live up to its agreements. It allowed white settlers to trespass on Indian land that it had promised in the treaties to protect. It paid tribes in supplies they did not need. Or it sent low-quality, spoiled food and broken equipment. And corrupt government contractors and agents often simply stole tribal money. Sometimes, new administrations, which is the people leading the government, ignored deals negotiated by earlier government officials. A few times, Congress refused to ratify, which means formally approve, treaties that had already been signed. Congress often changed the terms of treaties after they were signed, without informing the tribes. Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. In the 1850s, the government negotiated 3 main treaties involving Indian tribes of present-day Montana. The first was near Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming in 1851. Its purpose was to provide safety for settlers traveling along the Oregon Trail. The government invited leaders from the Lakota, Crow, Assiniboine, Gros Ventre, Northern Cheyenne, Shoshone, and other tribes. Word did not reach the Blackfeet in time for them to attend. The treaty defined each tribe's territory, except for the Northern Cheyennes and Arapahoes, since the government did not recognize them as separate tribes from their southern relatives. Identifying tribal territories was the first step toward establishing reservations. The treaty also obligated the tribes to make peace with one another and to allow the United States to build roads, railroads, and forts on tribal lands. The treaty also stated that the Indian people would obey the treaty that their chiefs signed, even if they disagreed with it. In turn, the United States agreed to pay a total of $50,000, which is equal to $1.3 million today, per year for 50 years in exchange for letting settlers and railroads cross tribal lands. Congress later reduced the 50 years to 10 years. The payments would be in the form of provisions, merchandise, cattle, and farming tools, and would be distributed among the tribes. The government also agreed to protect tribal lands from damage or losses caused by U.S. citizens, and to pay for any losses that U.S. citizens might cause. Hellgate Treaty of 1855. As more settlers pressed westward, the government increased pressure on Indian tribes to cede more land for settlements. In 1855, Isaac Stevens, governor of Washington Territory, traveled through the region meeting with Indian leaders. At that time, Washington Territory included much of Montana. In July, Stevens met with the Salish and Pend d'Oreille tribes at Council Grove, west of present-day Missoula. The Salish called this place Chilme. Stevens asked the Kootenai, Salish, and Pend d'Oreille tribes to cede a large portion of their traditional lands to the United States and to all live together on one reservation in the Flathead Valley called the Jocko Reserve. In exchange, the United States promised to pay the tribes $120,000 per year for 20 years in annuities. All negotiations took place between interpreters. There were many areas of misunderstanding. One Jesuit observer said the translations were so poor that not a tenth of it was actually understood by either party. Tribal leaders debated heatedly. Big Canoe, a Pend d'Oreille chief, said, "If I go into your country and say, 'Give me this,' would you give it to me? I have nothing to say about selling the land." In the end, however, Pend d'Oreille chief Alexander and Flathead chief Michel both signed the treaty. Salish chief Victor objected to leaving the Bitterroot Valley, the heart of Salish territory. Victor signed the treaty only after Stevens added a section temporarily reserving part of the Bitterroot Valley as Salish lands. Everyone left the treaty council with different ideas about what the agreement said. Tribal leaders thought they had agreed simply to share some of their vast tribal lands with a few settlers, and to allow roads across it in return for compensation. They also believed that the treaty guaranteed the Salish the right to remain in the Bitterroot permanently. But the government saw it differently. The United States believed that the tribes had ceded all lands except the present-day Flathead Reservation, and that the Salish had agreed to stay in the Bitterroot only temporarily. The treaty also allowed the government to pay compensation to the tribes in whatever way the president thought was best. The tribes had no say in when or how they would be paid. Lame Bull Treaty of 1855. In October, Stevens met with members of the Blackfeet Confederacy at the Judith River, which the Blackfeet called Utaquisisastan, meaning Yellow River. Gros Ventre, Pend d'Oreille, Kootenai, Nez Perce, and Cree leaders also attended. Here, Stevens told the tribes that his goal was to end warfare between the tribes and bring peace. This treaty outlined a large region in present-day central Montana as a common hunting ground to be shared by all tribes in the region. In exchange for sharing hunting grounds without warfare and for allowing the United States to build roads and railroads across Indian lands, the U.S. government agreed to pay each tribe $20,000, which is equal to about $423,000 today, every year for 10 years. The payment was to be made in the form of useful goods and provisions, with the U.S. government, not tribal leaders, choosing what those goods would be. The United States also agreed to protect tribal territories from white settlements for 99 years. Once again, Indian leaders believed they had signed a treaty that solidified tribal friendships with the United States. They also believed the treaty guaranteed them protection from settlers and offered payments in exchange for allowing settlers to travel across their land. The United States did not see it that way. A few days after the treaty was signed, an Oregon newspaper announced that all land not specifically set aside as Indian reservation was now open to settlement. This is why, when gold was discovered in present-day Montana 7 years later, prospectors and settlers saw the land around the gold fields as open for the taking. The Bozeman Trail and Red Cloud's War. The 99-year protection of tribal lands that the United States promised in the Lame Bull Treaty lasted barely 7 years. In 1862, the Montana gold rushes started. Prospectors and settlers began pouring into the region. The following year, 2 trail guides, Jim Bridger and John Bozeman, began guiding settlers in wagon trains up a shortcut to Montana's gold fields from the Oregon Trail. This shortcut crossed right through the last undisturbed bison hunting grounds of southeast Montana and northern Wyoming. In 1866 alone, nearly 2,000 immigrants trespassed on land specifically protected by the 1851 treaty at Fort Laramie. The settlers called this shortcut the Bozeman Trail. The Lakota and Northern Cheyenne sent military groups to protect their hunting grounds. They called on the U.S. Army for help. But instead of protecting the Indian land from the settlers, the Army built 4 army posts along the Bozeman Trail to protect the settlers from Indian attack. Over the next 2 years, Lakota military leader Makipia Luta, whom the whites called Red Cloud, led a series of attacks on these forts. These attacks became known as Red Cloud's War. Meanwhile, the Crow tribe negotiated for power too. For years, the Sioux had been expanding into Crow territory, pushing them westward off their traditional lands. The Crow tribe wanted the United States to help them defend their lands. The Crow decided to ally themselves with the U.S. Army against the Sioux, their ancestral enemies. Lakota attacks along the Bozeman Trail lasted for several years. In 1868, the Army abandoned the forts and closed the Bozeman Trail, partly because a new transcontinental railroad focused overland traffic through Corinne, Utah. As the soldiers marched away from the Bozeman Trail, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors burned the forts behind them. 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. Trying again. In 1868, the government came back to Fort Laramie to offer the Sioux and other tribes a new treaty. Many Sioux leaders resisted giving up any territory. But in the end, because the new treaty promised protection for Indian lands, the tribes signed. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 assigned about half of present-day North and South Dakota to the Sioux and guaranteed them hunting rights as far west as the Bighorn River. The treaty took land away from the Crow, who were allies of the United States, and gave it to the Sioux, the Crow tribe's ancestral enemies. Crow tribal lands guaranteed in the 1851 treaty were reduced to a small region of central Montana south of the Yellowstone River, between present-day Livingston and the Tongue River. The United States also promised to provide both tribes with seed and farm equipment, schools, and government agencies to help distribute other forms of aid. Just as before, the treaty did not acknowledge the territory of either the Northern Cheyenne or the Northern Arapaho. Once again, the treaty created misunderstandings between the Indians and the government. Red Cloud claimed that the treaty affirmed Sioux domination over the region. The government, however, thought that by welcoming schools, farms, and government agencies, the Sioux would settle on their reservation and begin assimilating into Euro-American society. Both sides were wrong about each other. Two ways of life collide. The records of the treaty councils tell a lot about what people were thinking. In the 1850s, native tribes still controlled the northern plains. But increasingly, Indian people saw themselves as unwilling hosts to rude and greedy guests, who demanded resources, fenced off land, and seemed to want everything for themselves. The government officials represented a nation that believed in manifest destiny, which is the idea that the United States had a moral duty to expand its culture across the continent. They believed their way of life was so much better that the Indians would soon abandon their own way of living, become farmers, and assimilate into mainstream American society. Settlers assumed that because Indian people did not build buildings, farms, and towns, the Indians were not really using the land. They also believed that the federal government should protect them from Indian attacks, even when they were trespassing on Indian land. Many settlers also had exaggerated fears about the American Indians around them. They did not understand Indian people's way of life, their values, or their traditions, and, like people everywhere, they often feared what they did not understand. Some moments of sharing and friendship. Yet even among the many misunderstandings of this time, many Indian and non-Indian people enjoyed peaceful, positive interactions. Indians and non-Indians traded, married, and befriended one another. Several stories tell of Indian bands traveling through Helena, Hamilton, and Deer Lodge, who camped outside town and staged friendly horse races against the townsfolk. Sometimes Indian people helped the emigrants, who are people moving from their home country to settle in a new place, traveling across their land. One emigrant mother crossing the plains laid her infant in some tall grass while she helped push a wagon out of the mud. Moments later, she turned to see a small gathering of Indian women around her baby. She yelled in fear, but as she ran closer, she realized the women were not hurting her child. They were singing to her. Shifting strategies of survival and defense. By the 1870s, the conflicts between the U.S. government and the Indian tribes had shifted from control of the roads to control over the land itself. Montana Territory now claimed more than 20,000 non-Indian residents. Its mines, towns, and lumber camps generated profits that were important to the nation's economy. The government wanted to protect the safety of these non-Indian citizens and the economic expansion of American businesses. Later agreements take more land. Railroad, mining, and ranching interests were quick to pressure the U.S. government to open more land for development. In response, the U.S. government repeatedly went back to the tribes to negotiate new agreements. Sometimes, the government did not even negotiate. For example, in 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant signed an executive order establishing most of Montana north of the Missouri River as a reservation for the Blackfeet, Gros Ventre, Assiniboine, and Sioux. A year later, he issued another executive order, shifting the southern boundary of that reservation north to the Marias River, cutting out some of the best traditional Blackfeet hunting lands. The government also insisted that Indians move to the reservations to prevent conflict between Indians and their new non-Indian neighbors. When the Indians refused to go, the government sent the army. Civil War military strategy on the plains. The military leaders assigned to Montana brought with them the strategies and experiences they had gained from the Civil War. In the Civil War, opposing armies settled into position before attacking each other on a battlefield. But Plains Indians warriors did not fight this way. Their battles emphasized personal bravery, horsemanship, and counting coup, which is earning respect by touching an enemy or taking his horse, usually without killing him. On the plains, fleet groups of Indian warriors on horseback could easily evade slow-moving American troops trailing tons of equipment and supplies. By the time an army detachment got to where they thought an opposing band might be, whole Indian camps would be long gone. This meant that there were very few opportunities for the army to attack Indian warriors. As a result, Army field commanders expanded on a strategy they had used in the Civil War called total warfare. The objective of total warfare was to weaken the people and destroy their resources until the people surrendered. During the Civil War, the Union Army had burned farms and crops, leaving many Southern women and children without food or shelter. The Army transferred this strategy to the plains. They attacked Indian camps at dawn, shooting into teepees. After the Indians fled, the soldiers burned their shelters and whatever belongings or food they left behind. The results for the Indian tribes were devastating. 1870 Massacre on the Marias. Strike them hard. Among the most dishonorable episodes in the history of the Indian Wars was the Massacre on the Marias. In 1869, some Blackfeet men killed a well-known settler named Malcolm Clark at his ranch near Helena. His murder was one act in a continuing family feud between Clark and the family of his Blackfeet wife. But the surrounding settlers saw it as random Indian violence against innocent citizens. Warrants were issued for the arrests of the murderers. When the tribe refused to turn the men over to the governor requested federal troops to get involved. In January 1870, General Philip Sheridan ordered Major Eugene Baker and the 2nd Cavalry to attack the camp of Mountain Chief, where the murderers were thought to be. Sheridan advocated the strategy of total warfare. If the lives and property of citizens of Montana can best be protected by striking the Indians, Sheridan said, "I want them struck. Tell Baker to strike them hard." Baker and his troops left Fort Ellis, near present-day Bozeman, and temperatures near 30 degrees below zero. They reached the Marias River, frozen, hungry, and eager to do their job and go home. Early one morning, they spotted a Blackfeet camp and launched their attack. Most of the men were off hunting, so the camp could not defend itself. Baker's soldiers killed at least 173 people that day, including 53 women and children. But they did not find the murderers. They had attacked the wrong camp. The massacre on the Marias River shocked and horrified the Blackfeet tribe. They realized there was no victory or honor to be gained fighting the whites. That winter, 2,000 Blackfeet died of smallpox. After that, the Blackfeet tribe did not make war against the United States. The Crow Strategy. Cooperation. Each tribe chose its own strategy for survival under increasing pressures, not only from expanding settlements, but also from enemy tribes who were themselves being pushed off their lands. The Crow chose to ally with the U.S. government against a common enemy, the Sioux. The Crow were surrounded by enemies, Sioux to the east, Assiniboine to the north, and Cheyenne to the south. Sioux forces had pushed the Crow tribe west from its traditional homelands into the Powder River area, cutting off the tribe from its traditional trade routes. As Crow leader Plenty Coups later explained, "Our leading chiefs saw that to help the white men fight their enemies and ours would make them our friends. We plainly saw that this course was the only one which might save our beautiful country for us." However, instead of respecting the Crow tribe as an ally, the government treated the Crow the same way it treated other tribes. Within 25 years, the 39 million acre Crow reservation was reduced to 1.8 million acres. The Salish Strategy. Economic independence. The Salish tribe chose to seek economic independence while practicing non-military resistance. Many Salish and Pend d'Oreille families recognized that since game animals were growing scarce, they needed to adopt new ways. They planted crops and built dairies, combining farming with traditional activities like bison hunting and camas gathering. By 1868, there were 50 profitable Salish farms in the Bitterroot Valley and 80 in the Flathead Valley. In the Bitterroot Valley, settlements crowded in around Salish farms. Salish people struggled to maintain peaceful relations, but they could not convince the U.S. government to leave them alone. In 1871, the president issued an executive order forcing the Salish people out of the Bitterroot Valley and onto the Flathead Reservation. The order stated that the government had surveyed the Bitterroot and determined that the Flathead Reservation was a better place for the Salish. Salish Chief Charlot protested. He and his people did not want to leave their home. When a government agent forged Charlot's mark on an agreement, he accused the agent of lying, and was eventually proven right. Meanwhile, settlers continued to take up land in the lush Bitterroot Valley. In 1889, however, a drought pitched Charlot's band into near starvation. The bison were almost gone. Charlot and his band finally gave in to the pressure to move. He negotiated an agreement for the government to buy out the Salish land in the Bitterroot. The Salish planted no crops that year in preparation for the move. Then the government stalled. For 2 years, no payments came. The Bitterroot Salish almost starved. In October 1891, Army troops from Fort Missoula rode out to accompany the Salish people on their forced march north to the Flathead Reservation. Chief Charlot and his people held an all-night prayer vigil and a feast. The following morning, they gathered on the main street of Stevensville. The Catholic priest blessed them. They sang Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, a funeral dirge, before marching north. Sioux and Northern Cheyenne Strategy. Armed Resistance. The Sioux and Northern Cheyenne chose armed resistance. In 1874, just 6 years after the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, prospectors accompanied a cavalry expedition to the Black Hills of South Dakota. They discovered gold. This was in the very heart of Sioux territory, protected by treaty, but that did not stop the eager miners. As gold seekers rushed in, the government offered to purchase the Black Hills from the Sioux. The chiefs refused to sell. Then the government tried to force the Sioux onto their reservation. The Sioux refused to go. In the spring of 1876, both the U.S. Army and the Sioux prepared for war. The Army gathered several thousand soldiers on the plains, including Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th U.S. Cavalry, plus about 300 Crow and Shoshone warriors. Meanwhile, approximately 5,000 Sioux and Cheyenne people, including 1,500 warriors, gathered in eastern Montana. They were led by Sioux chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and Northern Cheyenne chief Two Moon. U.S. troops and tribal warriors met in several fights that spring and summer. One of the largest was the Battle of the Rosebud on June 17th. During this battle, there were many acts of bravery on both sides. One involved a girl named Buffalo Calf Road Woman, who rescued her brother, Comes in Sight, after his horse was killed. In her honor, the Cheyenne people call the Battle of the Rosebud Kasi Sivo Stane Vioste Hesta Danam, which means, where the girl saved her brother. June 25th to 26th, 1876. Battle of Little Bighorn. The largest and most famous battle happened on June 25th to 26th, 1876. This was the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Army scouts reported a huge Sioux and Northern Cheyenne camp in the Little Bighorn Valley, called Greasy Grass by the Sioux. Army leaders formulated a plan. The 7th Cavalry, led by Custer, would head up the Rosebud Valley so they could attack the Sioux and Cheyenne camp from the east. The remaining troops would move west of the Bighorn River, following that stream south to attack. The army hoped to locate the Indian camp and quickly defeat it. Custer and the 7th Cavalry, together with his Crow and Arikara scouts, moved quickly. Army plans called for a coordinated attack about June 26th, but on June 25th, Custer learned that the Sioux already knew of his presence, and he moved to attack their village. As his troops moved in, Sitting Bull's followers rose up before them, a tidal wave of 1,500 warriors. In less than 3 hours, Custer and his immediate command lay dead, while his remaining battalions hunkered down to await relief. The Indians finally departed. It was a devastating loss for the U.S. Army. Public opinion turns against the Indians. Custer's defeat at the hands of the Sioux and Cheyenne infuriated the American people. That fall and winter, the Army hunted down the remaining Sioux and Northern Cheyenne bands with renewed intensity. They attacked the Indian camps, burned their food supplies and teepees, and captured their horses. One by one, most of the leaders, including Crazy Horse, surrendered and agreed to go to reservations. Sitting Bull, however, did not surrender. He and thousands of followers moved into Canada, where U.S. troops could not follow. But with the buffalo nearly gone, they had a hard time surviving. Sitting Bull returned to the United States, surrendering to the Army in 1881. 1877. The Nez Perce War. In 1877, several Nez Perce bands fled their homeland in a 4-month campaign for freedom that began in Oregon and ended in Montana. These bands of Nez Perce had never signed a treaty with the United States. When they were ordered to leave their homeland in Oregon and go onto a reservation in northern Idaho, they refused to go. "The white man has no right to take our country," one of their leaders, Chief Joseph, told the government agents. "We are free. We will go where we please." About 700 Nez Perce men, women, and children traveled nearly 1,400 miles across the Rocky Mountains. Many times they outwitted the pursuing army. When soldiers lay in wait at the mouth of Lolo Canyon, near present-day Missoula, the Nez Perce silently walked around them in the middle of the night. One August dawn, the army attacked the Nez Perce camp on the North Fork of the Big Hole River. The army overwhelmed the sleeping camp, burned lodges, and shot at the fleeing Nez Perce, including women and children. But their military leaders, White Bird and Looking Glass, urged their warriors to fight instead of run. After a day-long battle, the army retreated. Nursing their wounded, carrying their children, and in mourning for their dead, the Nez Perce fled south and east, then threaded their way to the Bears Paw Mountains, just 40 miles from the Canadian border, where they would be safe. Here, Colonel Nelson Miles and an army of 350 soldiers caught up with them and led a surprise attack on the resting camps. The Battle of the Bears Paw Mountains lasted for days and killed many fighters on both sides. Some of the Nez Perce people slipped away during the battle. This group made it to the Milk River, where they met a band of Métis. The Métis gave them food and helped them across the Canadian border. Descendants of these Nez Perce still live there today. Others, including Chief Joseph, surrendered on October 5, 1877. 1878. The Northern Cheyenne Autumn. After the Battle of the Little Bighorn, many Northern Cheyenne people were forced south to join the Southern Cheyenne at Fort Reno in present-day Oklahoma. Fort Reno was like a refugee camp. There was not enough food or medicine. 2/3 of the Northern Cheyenne people became seriously ill. They thought they might all die there. 1 year after they arrived, Northern Cheyenne leaders Dull Knife and Little Wolf decided to help their people escape and try to make it home. In September 1878, Dull Knife and Little Wolf led 353 of their people in a dramatic escape from Fort Reno. They traveled by moonlight, hid in broken timber, and tried to evade the soldiers sent to track them down. Near the Platte River in Nebraska, the group split up. Chief Little Wolf led one group to the Powder River area of Montana. They made it to Fort Keogh, near present-day Miles City. Chief Dull Knife, meanwhile, led 150 people northeast toward Sioux Territory to seek help. In October, they were captured by soldiers who took them to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Here the army tried to pressure Dull Knife into returning to Oklahoma. When he refused, soldiers locked Dull Knife and his people into barracks without food or heat. After 7 days, the people grew desperate. They said, "It is true that we must die, but we will not die shut up here like dogs. We will die on the prairie. We will die fighting." They dressed in their finest clothes. They had taken their guns apart and braided the pieces into the children's hair to hide them. Now they put them back together again. That night they broke 2 windows and ran for freedom through a hail of gunfire. In the first few minutes, 26 Cheyenne were killed. The people ran through ice and snow in below-zero weather for 13 days, hunted by U.S. soldiers. Of the 150 people captured with Chief Dull Knife, only about 50 made it back to their home in Montana. In 1884, with strong support from General Miles and other officials at Fort Keogh, they secured a reservation on the Tongue River. 1882. Louis Riel and the Métis Resistance. In the 1860s, the Métis people of southern Canada set up their own territorial government led by Louis Riel. It was a government founded on democratic principles and civil rights. In 1870, the Canadian government took over the Métis farms and towns and claimed Métis lands for English-speaking Canadians. Riel led a 15-year fight for Indigenous rights. Riel was hanged in 1885 for helping lead a rebellion against the Canadian government to protect Métis rights. Many of his followers fled to Montana, where they went into hiding. Some joined relatives already living on Montana Indian reservations. Others passed for white or settled near cities, creating a landless Indian population. A world comes to an end. In the midst of all this disruption came an even greater tragedy for the Plains people. The huge herds of bison, the foundation of every Plains Indian culture, became almost extinct. 4 powerful factors killed off the bison herds: disease from cattle and other livestock, changes in the ecology of the northern plains, drought, and a decade of wholesale slaughter by bison hunters. In 1860, there were 13 million bison on the Great Plains. Between 1871 and 1874, 3 million bison were killed each year. By 1883, fewer than 200 animals remained of the species that had been the center of life for 10,000 years. What is the most important resource in our society today? Is it water, electricity, oil? Imagine trying to live without it. Imagine losing something that is so central to your entire way of living that when it disappears, everything in your world changes. The end of the bison era meant that the hunter-gatherer way of life came to an abrupt end. The people had fought to protect their hunting grounds from invaders, but now the hunting grounds were empty of bison. Farmers plowed the best bitter-root areas. Settlers homesteaded where the wild asparagus grew. Army troops kept Montana's Indian people on their reservations. There, every family entered a period of adjustment as their tribes struggled to adapt to the new reality.
Expressions of the people. Ledger art. As the lives of Northern Plains Indians changed, their art changed too. The destruction of bison herds and other game animals meant that the people had fewer hides for painting winter counts or other kinds of art. They began drawing on paper, muslin, a heavy cotton cloth, canvas, and prepared cowhides. They usually acquired these items in trade at reservation agencies. Sometimes they took them from soldiers defeated in battle. Indian artists also gained access to colored pencils, crayons, and occasionally watercolor paints. These new drawing materials allowed artists to achieve far greater detail than they could get with bone or stick brushes. They also provided a wide variety of colors. The result was a vibrant new art form. It was called ledger art because many of the pieces were drawn on paper from ledger books with lined pages designed for keeping records. Ledger books were widely available and were the cheapest form of paper at the time. Most ledger art was produced between 1860 and 1900, a time of transition from traditional plains living to life on reservations. Ledger artists were usually men. They depicted important battles, acts of personal heroism, successful bison hunts, or meaningful celebrations that marked traditional life on the plains. Later, ledger artists depicted different experiences like farming, going to school, or riding on a train. Whether depicting scenes of battle, boarding school details, or household activities, ledger drawings provide a unique glimpse into the experiences and the artful expressions of Montana's Indian people in transition.